I remember the exact moment it stopped feeling like a drive and started feeling like a setup, because the rain hit my windshield so hard I almost missed the sign. White wood, freshly painted, carved letters that read, Willow Creek Estates HOA. Driven straight into the ground my grandfather spent 40 years refusing to sell, and I just sat there with my engine idling, wipers dragging back and forth like they were trying to erase something that shouldn't exist, because I knew that dirt, every inch of it, 1,000 acres measured, surveyed, taxed, and passed down to me 3 days after we buried him. And yet there it was, a gated entrance, paved road, manicured lawns stretching deep into land that used to be nothing but red clay and fence posts, and the smell of rain hitting dry earth. And for a second, I actually thought I'd taken the wrong turn until I reached over, grabbed the folder sitting on my passenger seat, and ran my thumb across the embossed seal on the deed, Walker family. Trust, same coordinates, same boundaries, same land, my land. And that's when the first car pulled up behind me and honked like I was blocking something that belonged to them, like I was the one out of place, and I eased forward slowly, tires crunching over gravel that had no business being there. And as the gate arm lifted automatically, I drove into what looked like an entirely different world built on top of everything I thought I knew. Houses lined up in perfect symmetry, mailboxes clustered. At the entrance, a stone clubhouse sitting farther in with lights glowing warm against the gray sky, and I could feel something tightening in my chest because none of this had existed the last time I stood here with my grandfather, when he handed me a rusted key and said, "No matter what they build around it, this land remembers who it belongs to." And I didn't understand it then, but I was starting to now, especially when I stepped out of my truck and the smell hit me. Not earth, not grass, but fresh asphalt and treated wood, something manufactured layered over something real, and I hadn't even made it 10 steps before I heard heels clicking behind me, sharp, deliberate, the kind of sound that announces authority before a word is spoken, and when I turned, she was already looking at me like I was a problem she'd dealt with 100 times before, mid-50s, perfect posture, expression polished into something polite but cold, keys in hand, white SUV parked like it owned the place. And she didn't ask who I was, she told me. "You can't be here." Like it was a rule already written somewhere, like my existence on this land required her permission. And I almost laughed because I thought it had to be some kind of misunderstanding. So I said my name, Ethan Walker, and I pointed behind her, past the road, past the clubhouse, out toward the tree line where the original fence line used to run. And I told her this property was mine, inherited, documented, taxed, every acre accounted for, and she just smiled, not surprised, not confused, just amused, like I'd stepped into a story where she already knew the ending. And that's when she said it, calm and confident. "This entire community is under HOA management." And she gestured around like everything I was seeing proved her right, like pavement erased history, like houses rewrote ownership, and I felt something shift in that moment. Not anger, not yet, but clarity. Because people don't talk like that unless they believe they're untouchable, unless they've never been challenged by someone who actually knows what's real. And as she reached for her phone, already dialing security like I was trespassing on my own land, I glanced down at the edge of the pavement where it met the grass, where the soil was still the same deep red I grew up on. And I realized something she didn't, something none of them had even considered, because they were standing on it, living on it, building their lives on top of it without ever asking the only question that mattered. And as the rain started picking up again, tapping against rooftops that didn't belong here, I tightened my grip on that old rusted key in my pocket and thought about the map folded in my truck, the one with boundaries drawn long before any of this existed, and I understood exactly why my grandfather never sold, because this wasn't just land, it was leverage, and they had just built an entire neighborhood on top of something they didn't own. And the only thing more dangerous than someone with power is someone who thinks they have it when they don't. Because what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that every road they drove on, every mailbox they opened, every door they walked through sat on paper that still had my name on it. And I wasn't leaving. I could hear her voice behind me, still talking into her phone, calm and controlled like this was routine, like I was just another problem she knew how to erase. And I realized something in that moment that made everything feel sharper, quieter, almost slower, because she was not reacting to me like I was the owner of anything. She was reacting to me like I was a mistake, like I had stepped into a space that had already been claimed and documented and approved by people she trusted, which meant somewhere along the line paperwork existed that told a completely different story than the one sitting in my passenger seat. And that was when I stopped trying to argue with her and started paying attention instead, because arguing with someone like that is useless when they believe the system is already on their side. So I nodded once, stepped back like I was complying, and let her have the last word while I walked toward my truck, and I could feel her eyes on me the whole time, watching to make sure I left, watching to confirm her version of reality stayed intact. And the second I closed my door, the sound of the rain hitting the roof got louder, like everything outside had been muted until that moment. And I just sat there gripping the steering wheel, replaying what I had seen, the layout of the road, the placement of the mailbox cluster, the angle of the drainage ditch running along the curb, all of it lining up too cleanly with something buried in my memory, something I had not thought about in years, until I reached over and pulled the old map out of the folder, unfolding it carefully across my lap. The paper soft and worn at the edges, ink faded but still precise, and I traced the boundary line with my finger, starting from the north fence post, following it down past the old creek bend, across the low elevation where the soil always held water longer than it should, and that is when it clicked, because the road I had just driven on cut straight through that low elevation, the exact spot my grandfather used to complain about when the county tried to push a development plan decades ago, and I could almost hear his voice again, telling me they would try to take it piece by piece, not by force, but by assumption, by paperwork, by time, until one day it would look like it had always belonged to someone else. And sitting there with that map in my hands, looking out at houses that did not exist on any survey I recognized, I understood that they had not just built on the land, they had built a story over it, one that everyone living there believed without question. And the more I thought about it, the more details started lining up in a way that made my stomach tighten, because developments like this do not just appear, they require permits, zoning approvals, environmental checks, title insurance, lenders, layers of verification that are supposed to prevent exactly this kind of situation, which meant either something had gone very wrong or someone had made sure it did not look wrong at all. And that was when the security truck pulled up beside me, tires crunching on gravel that should not have been there, a uniformed guard stepping out with the same assumption in his posture that I did not belong. And I rolled down my window before he could say anything, handed him a copy of the deed without explanation, and watched his expression shift just slightly as he scanned the header, not enough to understand it fully, but enough to recognize it was not something he dealt with every day. And he hesitated, just for a second, before telling me I should probably take it up with the HOA office instead of staying there. And I nodded again, calm, controlled, because now I knew exactly where this was going. And as he drove off, I looked back at the entrance, at the sign standing firm in the ground like it had always been there, and I realized that every person inside that neighborhood was operating under the same assumption Patricia was, that the land beneath them was settled, unquestioned, permanent. And the truth is that kind of confidence only exists when no one has ever challenged it properly, not with emotion, not with claims, but with something undeniable, something documented long before any of this existed. And I reached into my pocket, feeling the weight of that rusted key again, thinking about the old structures my grandfather never tore down, the places most people would overlook, and I knew that whatever proof I needed was not going to be in their office or their files. It was going to be somewhere on this land, somewhere they had ignored because it did not fit into the version of reality they had built. And as I started the engine, pulling away slowly, I did not feel like I was leaving anymore. I felt like I was circling back, because they had already shown me everything I needed to see. They just did not realize it yet. I did not go home that night, because something about the way that place sat on my land made it impossible to walk away from it. So instead I drove the perimeter the way my grandfather used to, slow, deliberate, counting distance in memory instead of miles, watching where the pavement ended and the ground started to look like itself again. And after about 20 minutes I found it, a break in the uniformity, a narrow strip where the grass grew uneven and the soil dipped slightly lower than the rest, hidden behind a row of identical fences that all lined up just a little too perfectly. And I pulled over, cut the engine, and stepped out into the damp air with that same quiet feeling settling in my chest again. The kind that only shows up when you are about to confirm something you already know. And as I walked along the fence line, I could see it more clearly now. The land underneath had not been leveled the way the rest of the development had. It still followed the natural contour, which meant they had built around it instead of over it, like they were avoiding something without understanding why. And I crouched down, brushing my hand across the ground, feeling that same dense, packed clay I remembered from years ago. And that was when I reached into my pocket and pulled out the key, the one my grandfather gave me without explanation, its edges worn smooth from time. And I stood there for a second just looking at it, listening to the faint hum of distant air conditioning units and the soft drip of water from the fence posts. And then I followed the line of the land until I saw it, barely visible behind a cluster of overgrown brush, an old structure that had been left behind, half collapsed but still standing, like a memory no one bothered to erase. And as I pushed through the brush, the smell changed instantly, less artificial, more like wet wood and earth, and I could feel something shift again, like stepping out of their world and back into mine. And the structure was exactly where I remembered it, an old storage shed my grandfather used decades ago, its door hanging slightly crooked but still locked with a rusted metal latch. And my hand tightened around the key without me even thinking about it, because suddenly everything made sense. Why he gave it to me, why he never explained it, why he always said the land would remember. And I slid the key into the lock slowly, feeling the resistance at first before it turned with a dull click that sounded louder than it should have in the quiet. And when I pulled the door open, the air inside was thick and still, carrying that unmistakable scent of old paper and sealed time. And I stepped in carefully, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through the cracks in the wood. And there, stacked neatly in a weatherproof metal container, were documents that had never been touched by anything modern. No digital copies, no scanned backups, just original records preserved the way my grandfather trusted more than any system. And I knelt down, opening the container with steady hands. And the first thing I saw was the original survey, not a copy, not a revision, but the initial measurement of the land before any development had ever been proposed, every boundary line drawn with precision, every coordinate marked in ink that had not faded. And as I laid it out on the floor, aligning it with the mental map I had built over the last few hours, the truth locked into place in a way that made everything else feel secondary, because the road, the clubhouse, the mailbox cluster, even the entrance gate all sat inside the boundary lines that had never been legally transferred. Not once, not partially, not conditionally, which meant everything built there existed on an assumption that had never been verified against the original source. And I flipped through the rest of the documents, finding tax records, correspondence, even a letter drafted by a land attorney decades ago outlining a dispute that had apparently been ignored or buried. And I could feel my heartbeat steadying instead of racing. Because this was not chaos. This was structure. This was proof. This was something that did not depend on opinion or authority or who showed up with more confidence. And as I sat there in that dim shed, surrounded by everything they had overlooked, I realized the most important part was not what I had found. It was what they had never bothered to look for, because they had built an entire community on top of a missing piece of the story. And now that piece was in my hands. And for the first time since I saw that sign at the entrance, I did not feel like I was walking into their world anymore. I felt like they had unknowingly stepped into mine. I did not rush out of that shed, even after I found everything, because I knew the difference between having proof and using it the right way. And the sound of rain tapping softly against the wood above me felt almost like a clock ticking, steady and patient, reminding me that this was not about reacting. This was about timing. So I sat there on the old floorboards with those documents spread out in front of me, reading every line carefully, not just looking for confirmation, but for weaknesses, for gaps, for anything that could be questioned later, because people like Patricia do not lose control easily. They defend it, they redirect it, they bury it under layers of confidence and procedure, and I needed to make sure that when this came out, there would be no space for interpretation, only facts that could not be ignored. And the more I read, the clearer the pattern became, because there was a point in time, about 15 years back, where the land had been referenced in development filings, but never actually transferred, which meant someone had built an entire approval process on the assumption that ownership had already changed, and that kind of assumption does not happen by accident. It happens when no one double-checks the original source, when everyone trusts the summary instead of the foundation, and I leaned back against the wall for a moment, closing my eyes, picturing the layout of that neighborhood again. The entrance road cutting through the low ground, the clubhouse sitting exactly where the survey marked a protected drainage zone, the mailbox cluster positioned right over a boundary line that had never moved, and I realized that every physical detail I noticed earlier was not just coincidence, it was evidence. The kind you can point to, stand on, measure, photograph, and that is when I started forming the plan, not something loud or aggressive, but something precise, because this was not about forcing them out. It was about letting the truth settle in a way they could not push back against, and I began organizing the documents into a sequence that told a story from start to finish. Original survey first, then tax records showing continuous ownership, then the incomplete filings that referenced development without transfer, and finally the attorney letter that warned exactly about this kind of situation years before any of this existed. And as I stacked them together, I could almost see how it would unfold, how each piece would connect to the next until there was no room left for denial. And I reached into my jacket, pulled out my phone, and took clear, careful photos of everything. Not because I doubted the originals, but because I knew once this started, I would need copies in more than one place. And when I finally stepped back outside, the rain had slowed to a light drizzle, the kind that makes everything look cleaner than it really is, and I stood there for a second looking out toward the rows of houses in the distance. Lights glowing softly behind windows where people were going about their normal routines, completely unaware of what was sitting just a few hundred yards away from them. And I did not feel anger toward them. Not yet, because most of them probably had no idea how any of this worked. They trusted the system they bought into, just like anyone would. And that is what made this different, because the real problem was not the people living there, it was the structure above them, the one that told them everything was settled when it was not. And as I walked back to my truck, mud sticking lightly to my boots, I thought about Patricia again. About the way she stood there earlier so certain, so in control, like she had already won a conversation I had not even started, and I realized she was not expecting anything beyond resistance or complaints. She was expecting noise, something she could dismiss, something she could manage, but what she was going to get instead was silence followed by something much heavier, something official, something that did not ask for permission. And when I got back into my truck, I did not start the engine right away. I just placed the folder carefully on the seat beside me, now thicker, heavier with everything I had found, and I looked once more at the edge of the development where pavement met the original soil, that thin line they had built over without understanding it. And I knew exactly where this was going next, because the truth was not meant to stay hidden in a shed. It was meant to be placed in front of the right people at the right time, and when that happened, everything built on top of it would have to answer for itself. Whether they were ready or not the next morning did not feel dramatic. It felt quiet, almost ordinary, which is exactly why I knew I was doing it right, because nothing about what I was about to start needed attention yet. It needed structure, so I drove into town before the neighborhood even fully woke up, parked outside a small office that most people would never notice unless they were looking for it, and sat there for a second with my hands resting on the folder beside me, feeling the weight of everything inside it not just as paper, but as leverage, as something that could not be ignored once it was placed in the right hands. And when I stepped out, the air was dry, the sky clear in a way that made everything feel sharper than the day before, and I walked inside without hesitation, because this part was not about emotion, it was about precision. And the woman at the front desk looked up as I approached, polite but neutral, the kind of expression that comes from seeing people bring in problems they think are bigger than they actually are, and I understood that. So I did not try to explain everything at once. I simply said I needed to speak with someone about a land title issue involving a multi-acre residential development. And that was enough to shift her tone slightly, enough to move me from casual inquiry to something more serious. And within minutes, I was sitting across from a man who had spent decades dealing with property disputes, someone who did not react to claims, only to documentation, and I placed the folder on the table between us, opened it slowly, and let him see the original survey first, not a copy, not a summary, but the foundation, and I watched carefully as his eyes moved across the lines, the coordinates, the signatures, and I did not interrupt, because I knew the moment mattered more if he reached the conclusion himself. And when he finally looked up at me, there was no confusion in his expression, only focus, the kind that comes when something does not align with what it is supposed to be, and I began walking him through the rest. The tax records showing continuous ownership, the incomplete development filings, the attorney letter that had been ignored, and with each piece, the silence in the room grew heavier, not uncertain, but certain in a way that made everything outside that office feel distant. And when I finished, he leaned back slightly, exhaled once, and said something that confirmed everything I already knew but carried more weight coming from him. He said if this documentation holds under verification, then that entire development is sitting on land that was never legally transferred. And the way he said it was not dramatic, it was matter of fact, which made it even more powerful, because this was not a theory, it was a structure that had been built incorrectly from the beginning. And I nodded once, not because I needed validation, but because I understood what came next, and that is when the conversation shifted from discovery to action. Because he started outlining the process, title verification, county records review, notification procedures, potential liens. And as he spoke, I could see the chain reaction forming, not in a chaotic way, but in a controlled sequence where each step would trigger the next without needing force. And that was exactly what I wanted, because this was never about confrontation, it was about inevitability. And before I left, he made copies of everything, carefully, methodically, and told me not to engage with anyone from the neighborhood directly until the initial verification was complete, which fit perfectly with what I had already planned, because the last thing I needed was noise before the foundation was set. And when I walked back outside, the sunlight felt different than it had that morning, not warmer, but clearer, like everything was now defined in a way it had not been before. And as I got into my truck, I did not feel like I was reacting anymore. I felt like I had already moved the first piece in something much larger, something that would unfold whether anyone was ready for it or not. And as I drove back toward the edge of that neighborhood, I could see the entrance sign again in the distance, standing exactly where it had been the day before, unchanged, confident, rooted in the ground that still carried my name beneath it. And I slowed down just enough to look at it properly this time, not as something that should not exist, but as something temporary, something that had been placed there under the assumption that no one would ever question it. And I understood now that the real shift had already happened, not out there, but here, in the sequence I had just started, because from this point forward, everything they believed about that place was going to be tested against something real, something documented long before any of them arrived. And the difference between belief and ownership is not loud. It is not immediate, but once it begins, it does not stop. And as I passed through the entrance again, blending in like any other car, I realized that no one inside that neighborhood had any idea that the process had already begun, that the ground beneath them had already started telling a different story, and the only thing left now was time. The waiting is the part most people get wrong, because it feels like nothing is happening when in reality everything is shifting beneath the surface. And over the next few days I did exactly what I was told. Nothing visible, nothing confrontational, just observation, because once you understand the structure, you start seeing patterns everywhere. And every time I drove through that neighborhood, it looked the same on the outside. Kids riding bikes, sprinklers running in perfect arcs across trimmed lawns, neighbors waving at each other. Like everything was exactly how it should be. And yet I could not unsee what I had already confirmed. I could not look at that clubhouse without seeing the boundary line running straight through it. I could not pass the mailbox cluster without knowing it sat directly over land that had never changed hands. And the strangest part was how normal it all felt to them. How complete the illusion was. Because when something is built with enough confidence, people stop questioning it, they accept it as reality. And that is what made this different, because I was not trying to break that illusion directly. I was letting something else do it for me, something far less emotional and far more permanent. And on the fourth day I got the call, short, precise, exactly what I expected, but still heavy in a way that made everything feel more real. The verification was complete, the records matched. The original survey aligned with county archives, the tax continuity held, and most importantly, there was no recorded transfer of ownership that would justify the development occupying that land, which meant the situation had officially moved from possibility to fact. And as I hung up the phone, sitting in my truck just outside the entrance again. I could feel that quiet shift happen, not around me, but inside me, because now there was no question left, no uncertainty, only a sequence that had already begun to move forward. And I watched as a few cars passed through the gate ahead of me, residents, coming and going without hesitation, unaware that something had already been set in motion that would eventually reach all of them. And I thought about Patricia, about the way she had looked at me that first day, completely certain of her position, completely unaware that her confidence was built on something that did not actually exist. And I knew that the next part of this would not come from me showing up at her door or raising my voice in a meeting. It would come from notices, from documents, from official communication that carries weight because it does not need to argue. It simply states what is, and over the next 48 hours that is exactly what began to happen. The first letters went out, not to the residents directly, but to the entities behind the structure, the developer, the title company, the lender tied to the property, each one receiving the same information, the same documentation, the same question that could not be ignored. How was this land developed without a valid transfer of ownership? And I did not need to be present to see the effect, because I could feel it the next time I drove through, subtle at first, almost invisible, but there. Conversations that lingered a little longer near driveways, people checking their mail with slightly different expressions, the clubhouse lights on during hours it normally sat empty. And then I saw her again, standing near the entrance this time, not greeting, not smiling, just watching, scanning every car that came in like she was looking for something she could not quite define yet. And when my truck rolled past her, our eyes met for a brief second, and for the first time there was something different there, not recognition, not understanding, but a crack in the certainty she had before, like something in her world had shifted just enough to make her aware that it was not as solid as she believed. And I did not stop. I did not acknowledge it. I just kept driving, because this was no longer about proving anything to her directly. It was about letting the process continue until it reached a point where it could not be contained or dismissed. And as I moved deeper into the neighborhood, passing the same roads, the same houses, the same perfectly arranged structures, I realized that everything still looked exactly the same on the surface, but underneath it, something had already changed, something irreversible. Because once the right questions are asked in the right places, the answers do not stay hidden, and the system they trusted was already beginning to turn its attention toward the one thing they had never verified, the ground beneath their feet. And the truth is, when that happens, it does not matter how confident you were before, because confidence cannot hold against something that has been documented, measured, and proven long before you ever arrived. And as I drove past the clubhouse one more time, watching the reflection of the sky ripple across its windows, I understood that the illusion was not breaking yet, but it was starting to move, and once it started, it would not stop by the end of that week. The shift was no longer subtle. It had weight, the kind you can feel without anyone saying it out loud, because systems do not panic, but people inside them do. And that is exactly what I started to see, not in obvious ways, but in small fractures that kept appearing no matter how carefully everything was being held together. And the first real sign came from something simple. The clubhouse, the one place that had always been lit up, active, almost symbolic of control, suddenly had a notice taped to the glass door, temporary closure for administrative review, and most people walking by probably saw it as a routine inconvenience, something that would be resolved quietly. But I knew better, because closures like that do not happen without pressure from somewhere higher up, somewhere that had already started asking questions that could not be brushed aside. And as I drove slowly past, I noticed two unfamiliar vehicles parked out front, not residents, not visitors, but people who carried themselves differently, focused, observant, walking the perimeter like they were mapping something invisible. And I did not need to hear what they were saying to understand what was happening, because I had already seen the documents that led them there. And later that afternoon I saw Patricia again. But this time she was not standing tall at the entrance like before. She was moving quickly between conversations, phone pressed to her ear, expression tighter, controlled but strained in a way that told me she was no longer operating from certainty. She was reacting, and there is a difference between those two states that you can feel even from a distance. And when she glanced in my direction again, it was different this time. Not dismissive, not confident, but searching, like she was trying to place something she could not quite identify. and I kept driving, same pace, same calm, because I was not part of her immediate problem yet, at least not in a way she could prove, and that was the advantage, because while she was trying to manage what she could see, the real pressure was building somewhere she could not reach, in offices, in records, in conversations that did not involve her directly. And over the next 2 days the pattern continued. More vehicles that did not belong, more conversations happening in clusters instead of casually in passing, more residents checking their mail with a pause instead of a glance. And then the next shift hit, quiet but unmistakable, a notice posted near the mailbox cluster, something official, referencing a review of land title and development authorization, not detailed enough for most people to fully understand, but specific enough to introduce doubt. And doubt is the first thing that breaks confidence. Because once people realize there is a question they did not know to ask, they start looking for answers everywhere. And that is exactly what began to happen. Neighbors talking longer, comparing what they had received, asking questions that no one in the HOA seemed ready to answer clearly. And I watched it all unfold from a distance, not interfering, not accelerating anything, just observing the structure respond to pressure the way it always does, slowly at first, then all at once, and by the time the weekend approached, the change was visible even to someone who had never been there before. The energy of the place was different, less certain, less polished, like something underneath it had shifted just enough to affect everything built on top. And that is when I knew we were approaching the point where it would no longer stay contained. Because once the right people are involved and the right questions are documented, the process moves beyond individuals, beyond personalities. It becomes procedural. And procedures do not care about who is in charge or how confident they were before. They follow the facts. And as I drove past the entrance again that evening, the sign still stood exactly where it had been, clean, confident, unchanged on the surface, but I could not help noticing how different it felt now. Not because anything about it had physically changed, but because I understood what was already happening around it, what was already moving beneath it. And for the first time since I arrived, I realized that the balance had shifted completely, not in a dramatic way, not in a way anyone could point to yet, but in a way that could not be reversed. Because once something built on assumption is tested against something built on proof, the outcome is not a matter of opinion. It is a matter of time, and time was no longer on their side. The meeting was announced quietly, almost like they were hoping it would not draw too much attention. Just a standard HOA board session scheduled for Tuesday evening at the clubhouse. But by the time I arrived, the parking lot was already fuller than I had ever seen it. Cars lined up along the curb, headlights cutting through the early dusk, and people standing in small groups outside instead of heading straight in, talking in low voices that carried just enough tension to tell me this was no longer routine. And I stayed back for a moment, leaning against my truck, watching the flow of people as they moved toward the entrance, because this was the first time everything would come together in one place. The residents, the board, the questions, and the pressure that had been building all week. And when I finally walked in, the air inside felt different, heavier, like the room itself was waiting for something to happen. Chairs filled quickly, conversations overlapping until they slowly faded as Patricia stepped to the front. And I could see it immediately, the change in her posture, still composed, still controlled, but no longer effortless, like every movement now required intention. And she began speaking in that same calm tone, addressing concerns, mentioning ongoing reviews, assuring everyone that everything was being handled properly. But the words did not land the way they would have a week ago. Because once doubt is introduced, reassurance alone is not enough. And then it happened. Not dramatic, not loud, just a shift in focus as someone near the front raised a hand and asked a simple question, one that had likely been forming in many minds at once, asking how the land title could be under review if everything had already been approved before they bought their homes. And for the first time, Patricia paused, just for a second, but long enough for everyone to feel it. And she responded carefully, redirecting, explaining processes, using language that sounded official but avoided specifics. And that is when I stepped forward, not quickly, not forcefully, just enough to be seen. And I placed the folder on the table in front of her, the same one that had been building weight since the moment I first saw that sign. And I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I simply opened it and turned it toward her, letting the original survey sit on top, where anyone close enough could see it, and I watched as her eyes moved across the page, and I could tell the exact moment she recognized something she did not expect, because her expression changed in a way that no amount of composure could fully hide, and the room shifted with it. Conversation stopped, attention narrowed, and I began speaking, steady, clear, not explaining everything, just stating what was already documented, that the land beneath the development had never been legally transferred, that the records being reviewed were not new, they were original, and that every structure built within those boundaries existed on property still registered under my name. And I did not need to say more than that, because the documents spoke for themselves, and someone from the side, one of the officials who had been present earlier in the week, stepped closer, reviewing the pages with a focus that carried more authority than any statement I could make. And the silence in the room deepened, not confused, but processing, as realization began to spread from one person to the next, and Patricia tried to respond, tried to regain control of the room. But the shift had already happened, because control does not come from speaking louder, it comes from standing on something solid. And in that moment, the ground beneath her was no longer certain, and I stepped back slightly, giving space for the process to take over. Because this was never about me winning an argument. It was about placing the truth where it could not be ignored. And as I looked around the room, at the faces of people who had trusted the system they were part of, I could see the change happening in real time. Not panic, not chaos, but awareness, the kind that settles in quietly and does not leave. And I knew then that we had reached the point where everything would move forward on its own. Because once something like this is seen, it cannot be unseen. And no amount of confidence can rebuild what was never actually there to begin with. The days after that meeting did not explode the way people expect when something this big comes to light. They settled, heavy and controlled, like a shift in pressure you can feel more than hear. And by the following week the changes were no longer hidden behind closed doors. They were formal, documented, unavoidable, notices posted not just at the clubhouse but mailed to every homeowner, statements from lenders requesting clarification, county officials marking sections of the property for review, and the tone of the entire neighborhood had changed from confidence to quiet calculation, because people were no longer asking if something was wrong. They were asking what it meant for them. And I stayed consistent through all of it. No sudden moves, no emotional reactions, just presence. Because once the process reaches that stage, the most powerful thing you can do is let it continue without interference. And eventually the outcome started to take shape in a way that no one could deny. The HOA board was suspended pending investigation. Patricia was no longer the voice at the front of anything, and the authority she carried just days before seemed to dissolve not with confrontation, but with documentation. And what replaced it was not chaos. It was structure, meetings led by officials instead of assumptions, conversations grounded in records instead of confidence. And then came the part most people had not considered. Because once ownership is clarified, everything built on top of it has to be redefined. Access, usage, agreements, all of it. And that is when I was asked to step forward again, not as someone making a claim, but as the verified owner of the land they had all been living on. And standing there in that same space where I had first been treated like I did not belong, I could feel the difference, not in how I stood, but in how the room responded. Because respect does not come from volume. It comes from what you can prove. And I laid out the only path that made sense. Not eviction, not destruction, but correction, a structured agreement that allowed residents to remain while formalizing land use under terms that matched reality, long-term leases, access rights, responsibilities defined clearly instead of assumed. And I could see the relief in some faces, the hesitation in others, but most importantly, I could see understanding, because the truth had settled in enough that it no longer felt like a threat. It felt like something that needed to be resolved. And that is the difference between conflict and resolution. One is driven by emotion, the other by clarity. And as the process moved forward, signatures replaced arguments, documentation replaced speculation, and slowly the structure of that neighborhood began to realign with the foundation it had ignored for so long. And one afternoon, a few weeks later, I drove back to the entrance again. Same road, same view. But something felt different this time. Not because anything had physically changed. The sign was still there. The houses still lined the streets. the lawn still cut clean, but because I understood what it now represented, not a claim of control, not an assumption of ownership, but a marker sitting on land that had finally been acknowledged for what it was. And I parked for a moment, stepping out just long enough to feel the ground under my boots. That same deep red clay beneath everything else, steady, unchanged, patient in a way that outlasts anything built on top of it. And I thought about my grandfather, about the way he held on to this land without ever needing to prove anything to anyone. Because he knew something most people forget, that ownership is not about who stands on it the loudest, it is about what can be proven when it matters most. And as I looked at that sign one last time before getting back into my truck, I realized it had never really been about taking anything back. It was about letting the truth catch up to what had always been there. And once it did, everything else followed without force, without noise, just the quiet, steady weight of something that could not be denied. And that is the kind of justice most people never see coming until it is already there beneath their feet.